In just 48 hours, Wall Street's biggest technology companies lost $2 trillion in value as markets reacted to shocking news from Washington. President Trump announced massive new tariffs that would fundamentally change how North America does business. A 35% tax on all Canadian imports and a 30% tax on goods from Mexico and the European Union were set to begin on August 1st. But Canada and Mexico weren't sitting still. They had already been planning something that could completely change the game. A $120 billion railroad and port system that would allow them to trade with each other without going through the United States at all. This Northern Corridor, as it's being called, represents one of the biggest challenges to American trade dominance in decades. The Northern Corridor, Northern Corridor, is not just an idea on paper anymore. It's a real construction project that will connect Canada's Pacific coast to Mexico's Gulf Coast through a single railroad line. The project costs about $120 billion and connects Prince Rupert, a major port in British Columbia, to a new terminal being built near Tampico, Mexico. The railroad uses the newly merged Canadian Pacific Kansas City CPKC railway system, which creates the first direct rail line from Canada's northwest coast all the way to Mexico's Gulf. The system also includes advanced technology that can clear shipping containers through customs in just minutes using blockchain systems. The people planning this corridor are very clear about what they're trying to achieve. They believe it could handle up to 50% of all the goods that currently move between Canada and Mexico through American highways and ports. According to government transportation data, that trade was worth a record $144.8 billion in March alone, the highest single month ever recorded. If even half of that cargo starts using the Northern Corridor instead of going through the United States, it would mean more than $70 billion per month in trade would bypass American customs completely. To put that in perspective, that's more money than the entire state of Alaska produces in a whole year. Political pressure builds. The political situation has been heating up quickly. On July 16th, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum and Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney held a phone call where they agreed to fast-track a new trade agreement between their countries. They hinted that this deal could be signed before the end of the year, well ahead of Trump's tariff deadlines. Every kilometer of railroad track being built now locks in future trade patterns. Insurance companies are already rewriting their risk assessments. Financial analysts are cutting their revenue forecasts for American ports like Long Beach. Car parts suppliers in Detroit are wondering how they'll compete with companies that can suddenly ship their products tariff-free through Mexico. This isn't just a blueprint sitting in some government office anymore. Concrete is being poured in Prince Rupert, and steel rails are being bent into place near the Mexican border. Each piece of construction represents another crack in America's ability to control North American trade through tariffs. Washington turns up the heat. President Trump hasn't been backing down. On July 10th, he signed an executive order putting a flat 35% tariff on every Canadian product crossing the border, effective August 1st. Less than 48 hours later, on July 12th, he threatened a 30% tax on all Mexican goods if negotiations failed. The tariffs are very specific about what they target. Steel slabs, rolled metal, engine blocks, and car transmissions face the full charges. Additional duties of 50% on raw metals and 25% on finished cars remain in place from earlier trade disputes. Canada called these moves economic blackmail, while Mexico described them as colonial behavior. Financial markets seemed unsure whether Trump would actually follow through, but currency traders told a different story. Within hours of the Canadian announcement, the Canadian dollar dropped by 0.25%, its worst daily performance in a month. The Mexican peso weakened by nearly 0.5%. Investors prepared for higher import costs. These might seem like small changes, but in the trillion-dollar foreign exchange market, they represent billions of dollars in lost purchasing power. For factories that buy American machinery, computer chips, and soybeans, Every drop in currency value makes American exports more expensive, potentially feeding the very inflation that Trump promised to fight. The infrastructure already there. Canada has been preparing for this moment for years. The government has opened a $2.3 billion funding program through the National Trade Corridors Fund, with much of that money going toward the Pacific Gateway Rail and Port System centered on Prince Rupert. The new CPKC Railroad, the first single track connecting Canada's northwest to Mexico's Gulf Coast. It links up with the old Kansas City Southern Railway lines going south. This connection cuts to 2-3 days off the travel time for any container that would normally go through Los Angeles ports. Trial runs by shipping companies show the dramatic time savings. A shipment from Mexico to Chicago that once took 7 days now arrives in just 4 days. But speed is only part of the advantage. Canada has been upgrading its border technology, switching from paper-based systems to digital processing. A nationwide computer system and blockchain pilot program have already reduced export paperwork time for medium-sized shipping companies from 3 days to just 4 hours. When you combine all these improvements, the math becomes devastating. For American ports and shipping routes, a train that clears customs while moving and reaches the American Midwest 72 hours faster doesn't just avoid Trump's tariffs. It completely changes how companies plan their deliveries, manage their inventory, and even schedule their factory shifts. The economic impact on America. Washington's tariff strategy depends on every shipping container going through American checkpoints. The Treasury Department has already collected $69 billion in customs duties for 2025, well ahead of schedule, but those receipts disappear if even half of the Canada-Mexico trade shifts to the Northern Corridor. The impact goes far beyond lost tariff revenue. American seaport activity supports more than a quarter of the country's total economic output, about $5.4 trillion per year, and employs 31 million Americans, from crane operators in Long Beach to warehouse workers outside Chicago. Every container that clears through Prince Rupert instead of Los Angeles pulls at the threads of this economic fabric. Yale University's budget research team studied the potential impact and released a sobering analysis in mid-July. They warned that the full 2025 tariff package, combined with retaliation from other countries, could reduce American economic output by 0.5% over the long term. That equals roughly $135 billion per year in today's money and could eliminate 641,000 jobs. Most of these job losses would hit the Midwest, where steel production and auto parts manufacturing meet agricultural regions. If these areas lose income, regional economic growth stumbles, factory orders become thin, and the housing recovery that finally gained strength after the pandemic could start to weaken again. Trucking companies along Interstate 94 already reporting that shipping rates are softening as companies explore new railroad routes that avoid Detroit entirely. Insurance companies, watching vacancy rates in Ohio, logistics parks climb toward double digits, are adding surcharge clauses to renewal contracts. Europe's green advantage starting January 1, 2026. The European Union's carbon border tax system enters its final phase. This system forces importers to buy certificates for every ton of carbon dioxide embedded in steel, cement, and other heavy industrial products. Current carbon prices hover between 63 and 75 euros per ton. A steel slab from a traditional blast furnace carries about 1.9 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, which would mean roughly 130 euros in extra fees. But Canada produces green steel in Ontario that generates only 0.3 tons of CO2 per ton. This means Canadian steel would pay only about 20 euros in carbon taxes, a discount of more than 80% before any customs official even looks at the paperwork. Mexico is playing the same game with lithium batteries. New plants in Mexico seem to meet the EU's benchmark of 55 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt-hour, which would allow them to avoid the carbon tax completely. Geography adds another advantage. Prince Rupert sits 500 nautical miles closer to Asia than any other West Coast port, cutting up to 60 hours of sailing time and the fuel costs that come with it. When you combine the 2-day shipping savings, the elimination of American paperwork, and the carbon tax advantages, the Northern Corridor suddenly undercuts the traditional Pacific to Los Angeles to Midwest shipping route by double-digit percentages. European buyers focused on reducing their carbon footprints are already taking notice. Car manufacturers in Germany employing Canadian steel mills for low-carbon materials, while battery assembly plants in Spain are lining up to test battery cells from Mexico. The future of North American trade, what started as a tariff wall, has triggered a fundamental shift in how North America does business. The Northern Corridor isn't just a freight railroad, it's a complete escape route from American trade control. If Canada and Mexico can move enough steel and electric vehicle batteries without crossing American soil, it could rewrite global shipping patterns and leave America watching from the sidelines. The next 18 to 24 months will be crucial. If the new shipping routes reach even half their planned capacity, Washington may face a difficult choice: drop the tariffs or watch Detroit lose orders to ports it can't tax. The irony is that America's attempt to use tariffs to strengthen its trade position may have pushed its closest neighbors to build a system that makes American trade policy irrelevant. The first freight trains on the Northern Corridor could start rolling as early as August 1st, the same day Trump's tariffs take effect. If they do, the Treasury's $69 billion tariff cushion could quickly turn into a revenue hole. Ports from Seattle to Savannah could lose traffic, and campaign promises about bringing manufacturing back to America might start sounding hollow. The question now is whether America will adapt to this new reality or get left behind as its neighbors build their own trade superhighway. The next trainload of goods moving through the $120 billion bypass might be carrying the future of American trade influence, and it won't be stopping for American customs.